Breaking tonight, President Trump winds down his trip to Asia by meeting with the Australian Prime Minister and the President of the Philippines. In a few moments, we'll go live to the Philippines, where President Trump is on the last stop of his historic trip. But first, if you're a Republican senator, you probably shouldn't watch tonight's show because you're not going to like what I've got to say. And by the way, the same goes if you're a Silicon Valley tech boss. But first, let's get to our top story tonight: the elite fight back against populism. Evening, everyone, and welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. The elites are out for blood. They scent a chance to crush populism, and they're going all out to do it. We've got to be smart to beat back this establishment counter-revolution. It started after Tuesday's election results, with the elite saying, look at the scale of the Republican losses among women, young people, minorities, college graduates. Populism has peaked, they said. It's just old white men. Hang on a second. Populism is different to and bigger than the GOP. It's about standing up for the victims of elitism, and here they are. Let's bring up our income chart. Under George W. Bush and Barack Obama, half the country saw their incomes go down. Elitism hurt men and women, old people and young people, those of all backgrounds in every part of the country. Positive populism means a pro-worker, pro-family, pro-democracy agenda to help everyone left behind. So don't let the elites tell you that it's just a narrow and negative movement. But the establishment fight back really took a dark turn with the allegations against Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore in the Washington Post on Thursday. It's obvious to everyone that this is a political hit job, plain and simple. The idea that this shows up a month before an election, after the Republican primary and after the Washington Post endorsed the Democrat in the race, the idea that this is a coincidence, some kind of fluke of journalistic timing, is laughable. In fact, if you read the original piece, the reporters basically admit they were down in Alabama looking for dirt on Roy Moore. But, as I said at the beginning, if we're going to defeat the elite fight back, we've got to be smart. Many Republicans are going around saying, if these allegations are proved to be true, then Moore is a disgusting child molester who has no place in the Senate. Yeah, child molesters are the lowest of the low and have no place anywhere in our communities, never mind the United States Senate. But let's be honest, there's no way the truth will be proved one way or another. Not next week, as Roy Moore's been saying, not before the election, not before he takes his seat in the Senate if he wins, not ever. All we've got is his word against his accusers. And for me, it was Sean Hannity that settled the matter. Did you hear his interview with Judge Moore? Moore was rambling, incoherent, contradictory, simply not credible. And if you read the testimony of his accusers, any reasonable person would believe them, including why they waited so long to go on the record. Look, the elite desperately want to paint populists as pariahs. Don't give them that satisfaction. For the sake of positive populism and the lives of working Americans everywhere, Roy Moore should step aside. Tell me what you think about that. Follow me on Twitter at SteveHiltonX. Tell me your views, and now let's get the views of our panel from the Washington Free Beacon, Elizabeth Harrington, nationally syndicated columnist and Fox News contributor, Richard Fowler, and RedState.com senior contributor, Kira Davis. So, Roy Moore, what have you got to say about that?
Right. I have to admit, I don't really have that much original to say on this anymore. No pun intended. I wasn't following that closely in the first place. I think your monologue was excellent, by the way. I think I would subscribe to almost everything you said there. And the only thing I would add is that I'm nervous about witch hunts, and I hate pedophiles. So, you know, and I think at this point, I know it's, you know, going out on a limb there, but I hate pedophiles. But I think at this point, you know, it's too late to replace the candidate. He could step aside, or maybe we just let the voters.
I think people have talked about potential ways of making what argued for happen. You know, delaying the race, writing campaigns. You know, it's happened before. Richard, are you looking at all this and relishing it, or?
No, I mean, I don't think I'm relishing. I think it's sort of it's a sad day, right? Because here's number one. This is just the beginning of. This is not the beginning for Roy Moore. Roy Moore has said more heinous and disgusting things besides being a pedophile. He's been on record saying that gay people should have the death penalty put against them. So his language and his rhetoric doesn't reek to me as populism. While he might vote as a populist, he might have a populist agenda. I think his language is very limiting to a lot of Americans. So I think this is the icing on the cake of what is bad news for the people of Alabama. And it's my hope that every Alabaman and every Alabamian who's a parent votes against this guy because he's a dirtbag. Period.
I think the point you make about populism is really true. It's like, if you look at the things he's famous for saying, the positions he's taken, they're not to do with arguments about what's happened to jobs and wages and the kind of things that drove President Trump to victory, in my view, and as we argue all the time on this show. It's a different set of positions, and that's why I think muddling it up with populism is wrong. I think it's important for those of us who really believe in populism, at least what I do, the positive version, to separate that out. But Elizabeth, how do you see it? I mean, remember, President Trump didn't back Roy Moore.
Right.
He backed Luther
Strange,
right,
which was the McConnell, quote-unquote, establishment pick. He was already serving in the Senate. But Roy Moore, he's going to be on the ballot regardless if he steps aside. But really what's interesting, a month ago we saw polls that he was already in trouble. He was tied with the Democrat in Alabama, which is it says something about the candidate he was before these allegations came out, that he was tied with the Democrat in Alabama. And I think it's because of those controversial statements he's made in the past. And these allegations, I think it's really going to hurt him. I mean, he could still win in Alabama, but he's going to be on the ballot no matter what. It definitely hurts the Republicans as a story coming out, but I think you said it, and plenty of Republicans have said it. There's really no place for him. The allegations seem credible.
So, Richard, you were shaking your head there at the notion that he might just win.
Yeah, I mean,
a lot of people think it's fake news.
Yeah, but
I mean,
what happens if that's what I'm curious. Like, what if he does win?
Well, what we've heard from folks in the Senate, a lot of senators said he will go immediately to the Ethics Committee and he'll be expelled from the United States Senate, which is the hope. Hopefully, Republicans in the United States Senate will have a backbone and expel him. I mean, no matter how the story comes about, what you have to give the Washington Post credit for is this: the story had 30 different sources. It's not 20. It was beyond the victim here. There's 30 other sources. So even if you discredit the victim, that leaves 29 other sources for you to follow up on. I just want
to pick up on that, because I suspect that a lot of our viewers will be thinking, you know, you use the word witch hunt and the phrase witch hunt, and it's a smear campaign and so on. I think it is really important to read that whole piece, because there are details in there about the testimony that I think really, you know, make you think, well, of course it's terrible if anyone can just trump up, to excuse the pun, any old allegation and derail someone's political career, wreck their reputation after, you know, whatever, 40 years of service. Of course that's terrible, and we don't want that to happen, but there's something, you know, you just got to read it. Read the whole story. I think that's important.
And I'm a big believer that there's a difference between allegations and truth. That's one of my pet peeves. Allegations are allegations and truth are truth. This particular story with 30 different sources, it's very clear where the truth is and where Roy Moore is, and we know the distinction between the two.
Weird.
Well, that's what I thought the Sean Hannity interview.
Were like weird. Your thing about that's when I started tuning in. I saw the Sean Hannity interview, and I was like, ooh, like he was like, oh, have you ever dated a teenager? Well, I don't quite remember dating a teenager.
Or I've asked their mother for permission.
If I did,
I know.
what was their mother?
But I think that's right.
No, I don't think that's the answer you want to give when you're being accused of molesting a child.
Okay, I've had enough of this topic.
Thank you.
Exactly. Let's broaden it out. So big elections. Not necessarily in terms of the scope, but like big in terms of their sort of impact, certainly on the elite and their argument that, you know, this Trump phenomenon, this populist phenomenon is all over, and the fight back began with those results, particularly in Virginia. Where do you see the lie of the political land now after those results?
I don't know that this is quite the event for Democrats to hang their hat on. I can understand why they're very excited. But look at who they were. Let's just take the governorships for starters. I can't necessarily speak to all the ins and outs of the state legislatures. But the governorships, you're looking at Chris Christie, who pulled that whack move by closing down all the parks and then taking his fat behind to the beach with his family while everybody else, people who lived at the beach, had to leave.
It was an amazing picture, wasn't it? It was really something.
So it's no wonder. Plus, it's very rare for one party to hold power once a term is up. He's served his term, so that wasn't a surprise. And then Virginia is right next door to Washington, D.C. No one can afford to live in D.C. anymore. They move out to Virginia, and people that work in government always vote for more government because it's job security.
Okay, so wait, I know you want itching to get out. I'll just get Elizabeth's sake, because one of the things that was said about the results this week was that actually the scary thing for Republicans was that you saw the Obama coalition coming back together, which wasn't there for Hillary Clinton, you know, the women and the minorities and educated and so on. What about the Trump coalition that put him in the White House, the people who actually managed to, you know, come together in greater numbers? And what do you learn from that? Obviously didn't happen this week, but does it say anything about its chances in the midterms or in 2020?
Ed Gillespie actually did quite well with some of the Trump voters, supporters in the southern, western part of Virginia, but there's not enough of them. And Virginia is a bad example to test this out, if this can be a way for Democrats or not, because those parts of the state that would be red and Republican, a lot of them have moved out. They don't really live there anymore, and they've been flooded in with Beltway elites right outside the Beltway. That turnout was up, you know,
but this is the point that I think a lot of people made. Just to ask word to you, whether or not, whether the Democrats win Virginia by 5 points or 9 points or 29 points, it's still the same number of electoral college votes. So with President Trump looking at 2020, does he really have anything to worry about just from the Virginia result?
I don't think you could talk. I think it's too premature to talk about 2020 because we're still in 2017.
Oh my gosh!
But here's the thing that we can learn from Virginia, and I know the state very, very well, is this. And I think you have to look beyond just the governor's race, because I think that's a top of the ticket type of thing. And when you're talking about populism in particular, populism is a grassroots up type of race. And so the race I focus on is the Danica Rome race, which was the race in a outward Virginia, D.C. suburb, maybe 20 or 40 to 50 miles outside of Washington, D.C. In this race, you have we call him Sideshow Bob, but his real name is Bob Marshall, and he's been in the House of Delegates for 3 to 4 decades, right, sort of pushing forward this very, very far-right agenda. Danica ran on the fact that in her district there's really bad traffic. She didn't ran on her gender identity. She ran on the fact that there's really bad traffic and I'm here to fix it. She beat him overwhelmingly. The Democrats managed to flip 15 different state legislature races, which is the first time they've done this since the 1800s, right? It's never been done before. And the reason why is because Democrats realized that they focused on the issues and they focused on the things affecting the people of Virginia, they could actually win the seat. Ed Gillespie, the argument that you've heard Republicans make is that he wasn't close enough to Trump. I reject that argument, and here's why. Because the arguments that you heard Ed Gillespie use was sanctuary cities. In Virginia, there isn't a sanctuary city. There's not one. The second argument that Ed Gillespie used was MS-13. MS-13 isn't in Virginia either.
But now we're having everything is. You're quite right. There's a lot of detailed local issues there. The reason we're going to speed up is because we've got President Trump live in Asia next, and so we need to get to that in a second. Thank you so much. Still ahead, I will break down the Senate tax bill and tell you why you, the American worker, may still be getting a raw deal. But next, as I was saying, we are live in the Philippines, where President Trump is wrapping up his trip to Asia. Welcome back. President Trump is in Manila right now, participating in a bilateral summit with another visitor to the Philippines, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. The president is also due to meet with the Philippines president and the Prime Minister of India later tonight. John Roberts is traveling with President Trump and joins us now live. John, the president of the Philippines, Duterte, he's a colorful character. What's the meeting with him and President Trump going to be like?
Colorful is typical British understatement, Steve. There's no question about that. I would say, in American, we would probably say highly controversial figure, and he has been since he was elected a year ago last summer, getting off to a magnificent start. Being sarcastic here, with President Obama at the APEC conference in Laos, where he called President Obama a, quote, son of a whore, causing President Obama to cancel a scheduled bilateral meeting that the two had. The reason why Duterte reacted like that was because he figured that President Obama was going to have words with him about his human rights record. And ever since then, things have certainly gotten worse in terms of the prosecution of the drug war here. While Duterte is certainly not claiming any responsibility for it, there have been extrajudicial killings here. There have been some 13,000 people involved in drugs, and whether they be dealers or whether they be users, who have died here in the Philippines. We don't know if President Trump is going to bring that up in their bilateral meeting. If he does, and he brings it up in an accusatory fashion, some sparks could fly between the two leaders. But let's not forget that there has been good cooperation between the United States and the Philippines as well, getting rid of ISIS-backed fighters in the southern city of Marawi, which President Duterte alluded to in his opening statement here at APEC. And President Trump didn't come here to confront Duterte. He's being very pragmatic in this trip. He needs Duterte's support in putting pressure on North Korea. He also needs his support for China's expansion in the South China Sea and trade and improving relations with the Philippines. So I think this is going to be more, Steve, of a get-to-know-you type of meeting. But there's no question that America is looking at Duterte and saying, what kind of leader is this really, and how is President Trump going to deal with him going forward?
Yeah. From what you say, I think it's very important they try and keep the president of the Philippines off Twitter, if possible. But anyway, one of the other things that has come up in the last 24 hours or so is with the meeting with President Putin and Russian meddling. And President Trump, there's been back and forth about what he believes and so on, but as I understand it, you've actually spoken to the president about that. Where does he see that right now?
I had an opportunity, Steve, to talk to him a couple of times. He telephoned me yesterday morning while I was at the presidential palace waiting for this press conference to start. I guess he was just leaving the hotel. We talked a little bit about his meeting with Putin at the APEC conference. He said it happened very quickly. He didn't have a whole lot of time with him. Putin came right out of the gate saying that he didn't meddle in the election. The president didn't say on the telephone whether or not he believed him. We talked about the statement that he made to the press pool on Air Force One, and he said, I wasn't saying that I believe him. I was just saying that, you know, when he says that, I think that he really means it, whatever that means. But then I had an opportunity to ask him at the press conference whether or not he believes what Putin said. He didn't come out and definitively say that he did or he didn't. He did say that he sided with American intelligence on this, which has claimed for months now that Russia did, in fact, interfere in the election. But the one thing the president told me was that, you know, he is trying to work with Russia, and this whole investigation going on in the United States right now really gets in the way of all of that. He also said that he's getting a bad rap in terms of his approach toward North Korea, that people are claiming he's trying to start a war. He told me, John, I'm trying to prevent a war, not start a war. Steve?
So, John, look, you're coming to the end of the trip. Overall, how would you say the president and the White House are viewing it?
I think that they're looking at this as being quite a success. Let's go back to Japan, where Shinzo Abe in that joint press conference with the president came out and said that Japan and Abe are behind the president 100% when it comes to North Korea, and that all options are on the table. Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, was prepared to meet President Trump and stand shoulder to shoulder with him at the demilitarized zone. But fog, unfortunately, prevented the president's helicopter from landing. Moon was already there waiting for him. He'd gotten there a little bit early, but the president couldn't land. President Quang in Vietnam, very happy with the president's trip, particularly this language about these Southeast Asian nations now standing on their own, not being a satellite or a vassal state of any larger power, that they're a proud people and they have their own economies, and the president wants to work on bilateral trade relationships with them. So I think, you know, in terms of those three countries, things were probably pretty successful. China was a tougher nut to crack, the president not really getting from Xi Jinping anything more over and above what he had already asked for, at least not that we know of at this point. And then there was this Russia distraction. But that's something that's being talked about domestically, Steve. I mean, we're not hearing from any leaders here at the ASEAN conference about, oh, you know, President Trump shot himself in the foot when he said that, or he stepped all over his own message. That's really something that's making the rounds in the United States and not really being talked about over here. Steve?
John, thank you so much. Well, you'll be heading home along with the president. I will personally miss our Sunday evening chats across the world, but thank you very much for joining us. Remember, we will show you live pictures of the president in the Philippines tonight as they come in. Coming up, the House and Senate each with their own tax reform plans, but which one will be better for working class Americans? And what will we actually end up with? That's next. As you know, we've been pretty clear on this show that the number one thing Congress had to do this year was deliver on President Trump's promise to get the economy moving. You wouldn't think it from the way the elite talk, but we have an economic crisis in this country right now, a crisis of jobs and incomes. As I've been saying all year, the top priorities should be a big corporate tax cut and a big investment in infrastructure. Those two things together would boost the economy's productivity, which is what a wage boost depends on. We're still waiting for something on infrastructure, but at least the House GOP tax plan a couple of weeks ago had that big tax reform for businesses. Then it was over to the Senate. They published their plan this week, and I literally couldn't believe what they did. I thought it was a joke when I heard it. I know they said, let's take the one thing in the House plan that most helps working Americans and delay it. What is the matter with these people? They say they need to make some savings to make the numbers add up. Well, how about saving some money by cancelling tax breaks for the rich, like the carried interest loophole that lines the pockets of financial wheeler dealers, or taxing capital gains as income so fat cats who sit on their backsides counting their money don't pay less tax than Americans who actually work for a living. Oh, wait, that would upset their donors. These Senate Republicans make me sick. If they don't change their bill and put working people first, they're the ones who'll be thrown out in the next revolution. Kira, last time you were here, you got all fired up over taxes. I think we all feel like that.
I was begging Congress to please just stop with these games and cut. And you know what, Steve? They didn't listen to me. Shockingly, they didn't listen to anything I had to say. And so here I am back again on your show telling, look, I love the corporate tax reduction rate. I'm with you on all that. But I'm not a business. I'm a mom. And I'm a middle-class mom. And these people are playing games. And you said it yourself. This is number shuffling. They're playing games. But let me tell you something, Republicans. My life is not a game, and my kids' life is not a game. And I think I speak for a lot of Americans here when I say we're kind of sick of you guys playing business as usual, while the rest of us have to deal with the consequences of your actions. You say you need the numbers to add up. I need the numbers to add up, and I can't get my numbers to add up. And now they want to make my life as a Californian harder by removing the allowance to deduct state taxes. I mean, we're drowning in state taxes here in this state. And now they want to make it harder for people who are trapped in blue states like we are. Then they want to mess around with this adoption tax credit. Oh, this is the pro-life party. And then when people get upset about it, then they want to say, oh, we had no idea. People get so upset. You know what? We're on to you. And 2018 is coming quick. Yes. And I don't think you can count on people voting you back in when these are the kind of games you play with people's real lives.
I completely agree, Elizabeth. Come on, then. What do you think? I mean, it just seems to me that they're completely out of touch with what really needs to be done.
Right. It's a little bit of tweaking around the margins. At least the Senate version, even though they keep 7 brackets, but at least all of those go down. Like the Houses, like some of them go up slightly, and it's just this tangled mess. The corporate rate is what's really kind of shocking, because I thought this was a motivating factor for Republicans to pass something by the end of the year because they're worried they're going to get killed in the midterms next year. So let's delay the one thing that can really get the economy going for another year.
Right.
I mean, they usually kick things down the road past the next election, but not when it's supposed to help their party win.
That's such a great way of putting it. I
don't
totally
think
agree.
they want to win.
Oh, well, okay, come on. You're just sitting there enjoying all this.
I am. I'm loving all of it because I think you guys are all right. And that's a rarity, but I do. Because I do actually think we should lower the corporate tax rate, number one. But number two, I actually think tax reform takes time. The last time it was done was in the 80s. It took them a year to get it done because our tax code is complicated. You can't get it done in a week and a half because we have a 1,700-page tax code. You have to read it and know what's in there and then figure out how to actually reform it. Okay. So the reason why you're upset is because they're tinkering with the numbers. And while they're tinkering with these numbers, they're hurting real people. I'll give you a couple of examples because I'm full of them tonight. Right? Example number one, they're hurting teachers. Teachers get a $250 tax credit, right? So to pay for school supplies. And teachers spend way more than that.
Okay, hang on a second. No, I want to. So why are the teachers having to pay for school supplies because the teacher unions that fund the Democrats are demanding so much on pensions that they're cutting school budgets, and that's why the teachers have to
that's
go
actually
there.
not why.
That's a whole other show.
That's a whole other.
Anyway,
that's a whole other topic.
I know. Second point.
That's another show. But no, the other thing they're doing is they're getting rid of the student loan interest rate deduction. So there's a lot of people like myself who and a lot of working families who benefit from the fact that they could claim the student loan interest rates because we went to college to help the economy, and the Republicans are like, oh, no, sorry, that's not a big deal.
I think they're good examples. Okay, look, inevitably, we're not going to have time to go through the whole thing. As you say, it's very complicated. They're good examples. You've all made the point that they're out of touch in one way or another with the needs of working people, and that's what we are so angry about. Coming up, the latest on the trade war with China. While President Trump backs off his hard line we saw during the campaign, there's bipartisan support for a bill to strengthen national security watchdog CFIUS. We'll bring you the latest next. Quite the turnaround from President Trump during his Asia trip, walking back the tough talk on China that we heard during his campaign, instead shifting the blame for the trade deficit to his presidential predecessors. Here's President Trump on Friday.
I do not blame China or any other country, of which there are many, for taking advantage of the United States on trade. I wish previous administrations in my country saw what was happening and did something about it. They did not, but I will.
Now, in related news this week, House Republicans introduced legislation on Wednesday that would strengthen the government's authority to control overseas investment in the U.S., giving more power to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. The bill, which actually has bipartisan support, would expand investigations by CFIUS to include minority investments in critical technology or critical infrastructure. And it's about time. Just a few weeks ago on this show, I called for more power for CFIUS. All Chinese companies should be thrown out of America, and we should use CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, to block any further investment by Chinese companies or the Chinese regime in our economy. So, Elizabeth, the argument I was making there was that actually, everyone's preoccupied with Russia, but the real threat long-term to this country comes from China, who's got a stated aim of military domination and economic domination, and they are literally they are forcing American tech companies to hand over vital intellectual property to them so they can be competitors with us. Now, I thought this was really interesting that since then we've had this bill to make it possible for this committee to block that kind of handover of technology. But what do you think, where do we stand on Chinese, on the sort of trade war with China, as it were, today after the visit of the president?
Well, the problem is with the technology in Silicon Valley, and this CFIUS right now only has the ability if they're a full acquisition, but as we know, they're taking up stakes in all these companies and get the secrets. So with technology, it's a problem because we have all this investment. We have, money coming into the economy. But what Trump did over in Asia as a start, he was trying to get $250 billion of business with China. That wasn't touching technology. It was energy. I think it was meat production. They're lifting the tariffs for automobiles and stuff like that. There's this tricky line we have where we want the trade imbalance to be better. We want to do business with China. But meanwhile, they've been doing business in one area, and that's in Silicon Valley in the technology sector. That is not good for our national security, as we've seen with this committee. So my view, Richard, is always that actually, I've said it many times on the show, we don't particularly want to be we're doing too much trade with China, and they're getting all the benefit, and actually it'd be better if we withdrew.
I think you're right. I think we're doing way too much trade with China, and as a result of it, we're losing a lot of American jobs, and a lot of blue-collar and white-collar jobs at this rate are now going overseas. But I think this is a very interesting needle for this president to thread, because you can't look at CFIUS and China in a vacuum. You have to look at CFIUS and China in the world where we also need China to help us deal with North Korea and Kim Jong-un. So what the president was trying to do there was sort of have a stick and also sort of give an olive branch to China and say, listen, we'll sort of work with you a little bit on trade because we need you at the table when it comes to North Korea, because you're the only person that could sort of pull North Korea back from the brink to solve what could be a possible potential nuclear war.
And do you think that's ever going to work? Will the Chinese really help us with North Korea?
I don't think they're really helping us with North Korea. I think everything Richard said, I would agree with. It's a fine needle to thread. I have to say that I have not read this bill.
Yeah.
And I really haven't been that interested in CFIUS up to this point, but I do hate pedophiles.
There you are. So I think that's, I think he should bring it up with the Philippines president. I don't know what his view would be on that. I totally agree. I think that this relationship with China is one that is just going to be so central to our politics, and it feels to me that it's not. It really doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
I tend to agree with that, and I also believe that I think what we're seeing with the Chinese is they don't like the fact they don't like military buildup in their sphere of influence, and as more and more ships go over there, as we do more exercises in the region to deal with North Korea, I think you'll see the Chinese become more engaged because they have a vested interest of dealing with North Korea, because if they don't, as the president has said,
I hope
we
that
will.
Works. But I mean, what was interesting to me during the campaign last year, there's a real overlap between the populist left and the populist right on this. You had the same sort of sentiment from Bernie Sanders. Is that going to continue with the Democrats, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a bunch of countries just signed another version of that without the United States. And it's interesting because a year later, that was one of the central issues that got Trump some of the Bernie Sanders support. And withdrawing from that at the beginning of his presidency was huge for that support. And I think he should absolutely continue hammering this trade issue and do what he can with China. But again, it's a tricky thing. But hey, he did say on Twitter, another tweet that didn't get as much attention, was that China's going to up the sanctions on North Korea. So we'll see if that happens, if this negotiation
I hope that works on that, but I hope that we up the pressure on China over trade. Thank you all very much. Coming up, are you addicted to technology? An ex-president of Facebook says that if you are, that's by design. What can we do about it? My radical plan.